Rain hammered the glass of a rundown diner in the city's forgotten quarter, and inside, a waitress with tired eyes balanced a tray on a belly she could no longer hide. Across the street, a black car idled, and behind its darkened window, a man who ruled the underworld froze at the sight of her face. 2 years. 2 years since she vanished, since he buried the wedding ring he never stopped wearing. He stepped out into the storm, and the moment their eyes met, the past detonated between them. She was carrying a secret that would burn his empire to the ground. Welcome to Afro-Korea TV. Please like, share, and subscribe. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and cheap detergent, and Lena had long stopped noticing either. It was the kind of place people passed through on their way to somewhere better. Chipped tile floors, a jukebox that only half worked, and windows fogged from the rain that never seemed to stop this time of year. She had been here 5 months, ever since her old waitressing job in the next town over had let her go for showing too visibly, and Mrs. On, the owner, had taken pity on her. "You've got good hands and a strong back," Mrs. On had said, sizing her up. "That's more than I can say for most people who walk through that door." Lena hadn't argued. She needed the work, and more than that, she needed the invisibility. A small town on the edge of nowhere, far from Seoul's skyline and its whispering elite, far from the marble halls and armed guards and the man whose name she couldn't say without her chest tightening. She had built a small, quiet life here. She told herself it was enough. She told herself a lot of things these days to get through the nights. That evening, the diner was half full with the usual regulars, a trucker nursing his third coffee, 2 teenagers splitting a plate of fries, an old man reading a newspaper 3 days out of date. Lena moved between them with the practiced rhythm of someone who had learned to keep her hands busy and her mind empty, one palm resting instinctively against the curve of her stomach whenever the baby kicked. The bell above the door chimed. She didn't look up until the room went silent. Seo Junwoo stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, his eyes locked on her like the rest of the world had ceased to exist. He was dressed the way he always had been, dark, tailored, expensive in a way that didn't shout but didn't need to, and even after 2 years, even soaked from the storm outside, he filled the doorway like he owned it. Because in every room he had ever entered, he had. 2 years had sharpened the hard lines of his face. There were new shadows under his eyes, a leanness to him that spoke of nights without sleep. But nothing had dulled the way he looked at her, like she was something he'd been searching for in every room since she left, and had finally, impossibly, found. "Lena," he said, and her name in his mouth still sounded like a vow. The tray in her hands trembled. Coffee sloshed dangerously close to the rim of a cup. "You shouldn't be here." His gaze dropped, slow and deliberate, taking in the apron, the tired lines around her eyes, and finally, the unmistakable curve of her stomach beneath it. Something shifted behind his eyes. Shock first, then disbelief, then a fury so quiet it was worse than shouting, because she knew exactly what quiet fury from Seo Junwoo meant.
"Whose is it?" he said.
It wasn't a question. It was a demand wrapped in restraint, and she recognized the tone from a lifetime ago, the voice he used right before he destroyed something. Around them, the trucker had gone still. The teenagers had stopped talking. Even the jukebox seemed to hold its breath. "Get out," she whispered. "Please, Junwoo. Not here." He didn't move. If anything, he seemed to root himself deeper into the doorway, as though leaving now, after everything, was a physical impossibility. "I'm not leaving," he said. "Not this time." Mrs. On appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, sensing trouble the way old diner owners always could. "Everything all right here?" "Fine," Lena said too quickly, setting the tray down before it could betray the shaking in her hands. "He's just leaving." Junwoo's eyes never left her. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about. There's a child," he said, low enough that only she could hear it, though the words landed like a struck bell in the small space between them. "There is very clearly something to talk about." She turned and walked toward the kitchen without another word, her heart hammering so hard she thought the whole diner could hear it. Behind her, she heard the bell above the door chime again as he stepped back out into the rain, But she knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, that this was not the last she'd see of him. It never had been with Junwoo. He didn't know how to let go of anything he considered his. And once, a lifetime ago, she had been exactly that. The next day, Lena arrived for her shift to find a black car parked outside, engine running, exactly where it had been the night before. She ignored it, ducking her head against the drizzle as she hurried inside, tying her apron with hands that hadn't quite stopped trembling since yesterday. She told herself she would keep ignoring it. She told herself that for most of the morning, right up until the moment the flowers arrived. By midday, a bouquet of white peonies, her favorite, the ones he used to fill their penthouse with, back when penthouse and theirs were words that belonged in the same sentence, arrived at the diner with no card. Mrs. On set them on the counter with a raised eyebrow. "Friend of yours?" "No," Lena said, too quickly, and busied herself refilling ketchup bottles that didn't need refilling. The flowers sat there all day, impossible to ignore, their pale petals a small, silent siege against every wall she'd spent 2 years building. That evening, as she walked home along the wet pavement, her feet aching and her back sore in the particular way that came with carrying a child through a 10-hour shift, a shadow fell into step beside her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. She could feel him the way. She always could, a kind of gravity that had never fully released her, no matter how many miles she'd put between them. "You've been having someone follow me," she said, not slowing her pace. "I've been keeping you safe," Junwoo corrected, matching her stride effortlessly, hands in his coat pockets, his presence a wall of warmth against the cold night air. "There's a difference. I don't need your protection anymore." His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking there that she remembered too well. "You're carrying a child alone in a neighborhood where 3 women have gone missing this year, and you think you don't need protection?" She stopped walking. Fear flickered across her face before she could hide it, and he saw it. He always saw everything, that had never changed. "You didn't know about the disappearances," he said, quieter now, some of the hard edge softening. "I can see that you didn't. I know about them because I've had people watching over this town since the day I found out where you were. That's not why I came tonight. But it's part of why I'm not leaving." "How long have you known where I was?" she asked, something between betrayal and disbelief coloring her voice. "For months," he admitted, and had the grace to look almost ashamed of it. "I told myself I was giving you space. I told myself a lot of things too, apparently." They stood there in the rain. 2 years and an entire unspoken history stretched taut between them, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. A few days later, Lena found herself agreeing, against every instinct screaming at her not to let his driver take her home after late shifts. It was practical, she told herself. The walk home in the dark wasn't safe, not with a baby on the way, not with whatever was happening to the women in this town. Nothing more than practical. But practical didn't explain the way her pulse quickened when his car idled outside the diner each night. It didn't explain the warmth that spread through her chest, unbidden and unwelcome, when she caught him watching her through the window some evenings, arms crossed, expression unreadable, as if memorizing every version of her he'd missed. It didn't explain how, on the 4th night, she found herself lingering a few extra minutes at the counter before heading out to the car, just to have an excuse to see if he'd still be there. He always was. One night, near closing, a man at the counter, drunk, handsy, refusing to take no for an answer, grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise when she tried to walk away from his table. "Come on, sweetheart. Just being friendly," he slurred, tightening his grip. Before she could pull away, before she could even cry out, Junwoo was there. He'd been sitting in a booth in the corner she hadn't even noticed, nursing a coffee he clearly had no intention of drinking, watching over her the way he apparently now did every night without her knowledge. The man was on the floor before Lena fully registered what had happened, and the entire diner had gone deathly silent. "Touch her again," Junwoo said, voice like ice over steel, crouched over the man with a stillness that was somehow more frightening than any shout could have been, "and they won't find enough of you to bury." "Junwoo." Lena grabbed his arm, her voice sharp with panic. "Stop. Stop, please." He looked at her, and the fury in his eyes melted instantly into something raw and pleading, his hand coming up to hover near her bruised wrist without quite touching it, as though asking permission he wasn't sure he deserved. "I can't watch someone hurt you and do nothing. Not again. Not again." The words hung between them, heavier than either of them wanted to admit, and Lena felt something crack open in her chest that she'd spent 2 years trying to seal shut. The drunk man scrambled up and fled into the night without paying his tab. Mrs. On, watching from behind the counter, said nothing, but the look she gave Lena afterwards said quite a lot. By the end of the week, Lena's guard had cracked, just slightly, enough for old wounds to breathe for the first time in 2 years. They sat in his car outside her apartment building, rain streaking the windows, the engine off, silence stretching taut between them in a way that felt less like tension now and more like the held breath before a confession. "Why did you leave?" he finally asked. Not angry, just aching, in a way she hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for. Lena stared out at the rain-blurred streetlights, working her jaw, trying to decide if 2 years had earned him the truth. "Because I heard you," she said at last, voice trembling. "The night before I left. I came to bring you tea in your study and the door was open, and I heard you on the phone with your uncle. You told him I was a liability, that marrying me was a mistake for the family, that you'd handle it." His face went pale in the dim light of the dashboard. "You heard half a conversation and ran." "I heard enough," she snapped, the old hurt rising sharp and immediate, as fresh as the night it happened. "I heard my husband tell his uncle that loving me was a mistake he needed to handle." "I was protecting you," he said, leaning forward, desperation breaking through his composure for the first time she'd seen since he'd walked back into her life. "My uncle wanted you gone permanently, Lena. Not divorced.
Gone.
He'd found out things about your family, about debts your father owed to people who don't forgive debts. He saw you as a liability to be removed, and I said those exact words back to him, that I would handle it, that you were a liability because it was the only way to make him think I was already dealing with it my way, so he wouldn't send his own people to deal with it his way. I've spent every single day since regretting that I didn't explain that to you first, that I let you overhear a lie meant to save your life and mistake it for the truth." Lena's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Her hands twisted in her lap. "You could have told me the truth. Any of it. Instead, I spent 2 years thinking the man I married saw me as a burden." "I know." His voice cracked, and for a moment the most feared man in the city's underworld looked entirely undone, folding forward until his forehead nearly touched the steering wheel. "I know, and it's the biggest regret of my life. I looked for you for 6 months before I found the first trace. Another year before I found you here. I told myself I'd give you the space to hate me if that's what you needed. I didn't expect." His eyes flicked helplessly to her stomach. "I didn't expect this." The rain softened outside, easing from a downpour to a whisper against the glass. Neither of them moved. "Is it mine?" he finally asked, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, and the vulnerability in the question. This man who commanded fear from grown men with a single look, terrified of an answer, undid something in her. "Yes," she said.
"She's yours."
"She's due in 6 weeks." He made a sound she'd never heard from him before, something between a laugh and a sob, quickly swallowed. "She." "A girl," Lena confirmed, and for the first time in 2 years, she let herself smile, just slightly, at the wonder on his face. Later that night, she let him walk her to her door. Neither of them said goodbye. Neither of them wanted to. A week later, Lena's guard continued its slow, reluctant thaw. Junwoo had taken a room at the town's only hotel, a modest thing, nothing like the properties he owned across Seoul, and made no move to rush her, no move to demand anything beyond her presence in his evenings. He came to the diner every night. He learned the names of her coworkers. He tipped Mrs. On generously enough that the older woman had, without subtlety, started referring to him as your husband within the first 3 days. "He's not my husband," Lena had corrected more than once. Mrs. On had replied, entirely unconvinced, and gone back to wiping down the counter. One evening, after close, Junwoo lingered while Lena finished stacking chairs, an old habit from a childhood job she'd never quite let go of. He picked up a chair without being asked and set it on a table beside hers.
You don't have to do that, she said.
I know. He picked up another one anyway. They worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the scrape of chair legs against tile and the low hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. It was, Lena realized with some surprise, almost peaceful. Almost like something they might have done together in another life, if that life had gone differently. Tell me about her, Junwoo said suddenly, nodding at her stomach. The pregnancy. What it's been like. I've missed, he stopped, jaw working. I've missed all of it. So she told him. About the exhaustion of the first months, working shifts on her feet while nauseous and terrified and alone. About the ultrasound she'd gone to by herself, crying in the parking lot afterward, because there was no one to share the photo with. About the name she'd already half chosen, though she wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. He listened to all of it with a stillness that told her he was memorizing every word, filing it away like something precious he could never get back but refused to lose any further piece of. I'm sorry, he said when she finished. For all of it. For every part you had to do alone. I managed, she said, but her voice wavered on the word. You shouldn't have had to. One night, a man at the counter, drunk, handsy, refusing to take no for an answer, grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise. Before she could pull away, Junwoo was there, and the man was on the floor, and the entire diner had gone deathly silent. Touch her again, Junwoo said, voice like ice over steel, and they won't find enough of you to bury. Lena grabbed his arm. Junwoo, stop. He looked at her, and the fury in his eyes melted instantly into something raw and pleading. I can't watch someone hurt you and do nothing. Not again. Not again. The words hung between them, heavier than either of them wanted to admit. What neither of them knew, what neither of them could have known, tucked away in the quiet routines of a small-town diner and a rekindling that felt, for the first time in 2 years, like something safe, was that Junwoo's presence in town had not gone unnoticed. The Beck family had never forgiven him for refusing an alliance 5 years earlier, a refusal that had cost their organization a foothold in the northern ports and humiliated their aging patriarch in front of the entire syndicate council. They had waited, patient in the way only old grudges could be, for an opportunity. And Seo Junwoo, the untouchable, the man who never let anything or anyone matter enough to be used against him, had just handed them one. A week later, it happened. Lena was walking home from a late shift, Junwoo's driver delayed by a flat tire, a small, ordinary misfortune that would haunt him for the rest of his life, when a van pulled alongside her on the empty street. Before she could scream, hands seized her from behind, a cloth pressed over her mouth, and the world tilted and went dark. When Junwoo arrived at the diner that evening, running late himself after a call with his security chief about the missing women's case he'd quietly been having his people investigate, he found her gone. Her apron abandoned on the floor by the register. Her phone, screen cracked, lying in a puddle at the edge of the parking lot. And pinned beneath the diner's register, a folded note in handwriting he didn't recognize but a message he understood instantly, viscerally, in every cell of his body. We have what's yours. Come alone, or she disappears for good. You know where to find us. Something inside him broke and reformed into something far more dangerous than grief. Mrs. On found him standing motionless in the middle of the empty diner, the note trembling in his hand, and for the first time in the week she'd known him, she saw something in his face that made her take an instinctive step backward. Call the police, she said. No, he said, and his voice had changed entirely, flat, cold, final. The police can't do what needs to be done tonight. He called every man loyal to him. Within the hour, a convoy of black cars had descended on the sleepy town, and Seo Junwoo, the man who had spent 2 years being gentle, being patient, being a version of himself he'd almost forgotten he was capable of, became, once again, the man an entire underworld feared. He tore through the city's criminal networks like a storm given human form. Rivals who had spent years hearing stories about his ruthlessness learned, that night, that they had never truly seen him angry. Not like this. Not with everything on the line. Where, he said to a trembling informant, gripping the man's collar and lifting him half off the ground, is she? Hours later, after a trail of threats and broken alliances and doors kicked in across 3 different districts, he found the warehouse, an abandoned shipping facility on the edge of the industrial docks, exactly the kind of place the Beck family had always favored for their dirty business. Guards fell before they could raise their weapons, his men moving through the perimeter with the brutal efficiency of soldiers who had trained for exactly this. Junwoo walked through gunfire like it was rain, driven by something that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with terror. Terror that he would lose her, and the child he hadn't even known was his to protect until 2 weeks ago, in a warehouse that smelled of rust and rain and old cargo. He found her tied to a chair in a cold, dim room at the back of the facility, pale and shaking but alive, impossibly, mercifully alive. Relief hit him so hard his knees nearly buckled, and for one raw second, the fear he'd been holding back for hours broke fully across his face before he could master it. Junwoo, she breathed, tears spilling over, her voice hoarse from crying, from calling for help that never came, from the sheer exhausted terror of hours spent not knowing if she or her daughter would survive the night. Stomach, over her wrists where the ropes had bitten into skin, searching for any sign of harm with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could have. "The baby, I am here," he said, crossing the room in 3 strides, cutting her free with hands that trembled for the first time in years he could remember. "I'm here. I've got you. I will always come for you, do you understand me? Always." She sobbed into his shoulder as he checked her over frantically, hands ghosting over her, she gasped. I think I'm okay, but I've been having pains, I don't know if. We're getting you to a hospital right now," he said, already lifting her, cradling her against his chest as though she weighed nothing at all, as though the 2 years and the danger and everything unsaid between them had simply dissolved in the face of the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The Beck family's second-in-command emerged from the shadows at the doorway, gun raised, his face twisted with the particular fury of a man watching his leverage walk out the door. "One more step, and I put a bullet in both of them." Junwoo didn't let him finish the sentence. What happened next was fast, brutal, and final, executed with the cold precision of a man who had spent 2 years learning to be gentle and had just remembered, in the space of a single breath, exactly what he was capable of when the person he loved was threatened. When it was over, he didn't look back. He simply pulled Lena tighter against his chest, shielding her eyes, and carried her out into the night air, toward the ambulance his men had already called. "Never again," he whispered into her hair as they waited for the paramedics, his voice breaking on every word. "I will never let anyone touch you again. I swear it on everything I am." In the weeks that followed, Lena recovered in the quiet safety of Junwoo's estate, a sprawling, elegant property outside Seoul that she once swore she'd never set foot in again. But everything felt different now, walking through those same halls she remembered so vividly. The walls that once felt like a cage now felt, for the first time, like shelter freely chosen rather than a gilded trap she'd been too afraid to question. The doctors confirmed what Junwoo had prayed for through every terrified minute of that ambulance ride. Lena and the baby were both fine, shaken but unharmed, the pains nothing more than the body's response to trauma, and adrenaline rather than the beginning of something worse. He had wept, quietly, in the hospital corridor when the doctor told him, the kind of tears he hadn't let himself shed since he was a boy. Junwoo was there every morning before she woke, and every night after she fell asleep, as if terrified that looking away even once might make her vanish again the way she had 2 years ago. He was gentler than the version of him she remembered from their first marriage, softer around the edges, quicker to laugh at small things, slower to let go of her hand once he'd taken it. The war he'd waged against the Beck family in the days following her rescue had been swift, total, and absolute. Within a week, what remained of their organization had scattered or surrendered, and no whisper of threat toward Lena or her daughter would ever come from that direction again. But it wasn't the danger that had changed him most. It was the fear of losing her that had stripped away whatever walls still remained between the man the world feared and the man he actually was underneath it. One evening, as she sat on the balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and rose, her hands folded over the swell of her stomach, he knelt beside her chair, and for once, the most powerful man in the city looked entirely undone. No composure, no careful distance, nothing but raw, unguarded hope. "I know I don't deserve a second chance," he said, his voice steady despite the way his hands weren't quite. "I know I made mistakes that cost us 2 years we'll never get back. 2 years I should have spent finding a way to make you understand instead of letting pride and fear keep me silent. I know I let you carry our daughter alone for months that I can never give back to either of you. But I am asking anyway because my life without you was never a life at all. It was just waiting. 2 years of simply waiting for the day I'd find you again, and I didn't even let myself hope it would feel like this." He opened his palm. Inside sat the wedding ring he'd never stopped wearing on a chain beneath his shirt, close to his heart. For the entire 2 years she'd been gone, resized now, quietly, sometime in the past week, waiting, hopeful. "Marry me again, Lena. Not because of the baby, though I will love her more than my own life from the moment she's born. Not because of duty, or family, or anything anyone else expects of us. Marry me because I have never once, in 2 years, stopped loving you, not for a single day, not even the days I told myself I should stop trying." Her tears fell freely now, but for the first time in 2 years, they didn't hurt. They felt like release. "You already have my heart, Junwoo," she whispered, pressing her palm against his cheek. "You never actually lost it. I just needed to believe you'd fight for it before I let myself hand it back to you." "I will fight for it every single day for the rest of my life," he said. "That's not a promise. It's just the truth of what I already am." A month later, in a small, quiet ceremony beneath a canopy of white peonies, no cameras, no empire on display, no danger lurking at the edges, Lena became his wife again, this time with nothing hidden between them, nothing overheard and misunderstood, nothing left to fear. Mrs. Unattended, dressed in her Sunday best, crying more than anyone expected and denying it fiercely to anyone who mentioned it. 6 weeks after that, on a quiet, ordinary morning that felt anything but ordinary, their daughter was born. Seo Junwoo, the man feared across an entire underworld, the man who had burned down a rival organization in a single night to save the people he loved, wept openly in the hospital room, cradling his daughter against his chest like she was the only fragile, precious thing in a world made otherwise of steel and shadows, because to him, in that moment, she was. "What do we call her?" he asked, voice thick, unable to look away from the tiny face blinking up at him. Lena, exhausted and glowing, reached over to brush her fingers against her daughter's small hand. "I was thinking Hannah," she said softly. "It means flower. Like the ones you never stop sending me." Something broke open in his chest, warm and overwhelming. "Hannah," he repeated, testing the name against the small weight in his arms, and it fit perfectly, the way everything about this unexpected, impossible, hard-won life had somehow finally begun to fit. Lena watched him, this man who had once told his uncle a lie to save her life and lost her because of it, who had spent 2 years searching, who had burned an empire's worth of enemies to the ground the moment she was threatened, who now sat cradling their daughter like she was the answer to every prayer he'd never let himself say out loud, and thought of everything they'd survived to arrive at this single, perfect moment. "Welcome home," she whispered to him, to their daughter, to the life they'd fought so hard, against so much, to finally keep. Outside the hospital window, the first pale light of morning broke over the Seoul skyline, gentle and golden, chasing away the last of the night.